I'm Private Marcus Webb, and I'm writing this from the locked medical wing of Area 51 after being exposed to the ancient object they keep in the deepest vault. An exposure that has left me able to see things that exist between the seconds of normal time and hear voices speaking in languages that predate human speech. The artifact looks like a simple grey rock to most people, but ever since I touched it during a routine security check, I can see it for what it really is. A window into the past that shows Earth as it existed 2.8 billion years ago, when our planet was home to creatures so alien and powerful that they built cities from living stone and travelled between worlds by folding space like paper. The worst part is not what I saw in the visions the artifact showed me, but what I learned about why it was really placed in that vault. It's not being studied by our scientists, but is actually studying us, learning everything about human civilization so it can report back to the ancient beings who placed it here as a spy. Beings who have been waiting patiently in another dimension for their scout to tell them that Earth has finally developed a species intelligent enough to serve as their new servants when they decide to return home. The pen keeps slipping from my fingers. Every few minutes, reality hiccups, like a scratched DVD skipping backward 3 seconds. During those skips, I see the medical wing as it really is. Not the sterile white room with monitoring equipment, but a pulsing organic chamber with walls that breathe and medical instruments that whisper in unison. Dr. Kowalski thinks I'm suffering from acute temporal displacement psychosis. That's what they're calling it in my file. But Kowalski doesn't know that I watched him die yesterday during one of the time slips. Watched something wearing his face peel off his skin like a wetsuit and step out, still talking about my blood work in his same monotone voice. 3 days ago, I was just another grunt pulling 12-hour shifts in the Nevada desert, bitching about the heat and wondering why the hell I'd signed up for this classified bullshit assignment. Now I'm patient zero in humanity's last days, and the only reason I'm still breathing is because they need to understand what's happening to me before they put a bullet in my skull. The voices are getting louder. They speak in harmonics that make my molars vibrate, telling me about the Great Convergence, about flesh cities and thought networks that span galaxies. Sometimes I catch fragments in almost English, the harvest approaches, and quite such beautiful meat thoughts. My reflection in the medical bay window keeps changing. Sometimes it's me. Sometimes it's something else entirely, something with too many joints and eyes that reflect starlight from dimensions we haven't named yet. I need to write this down before they figure out what I've become, before the security cameras catch me documenting their precious secret, because in approximately 6 hours, during the 0300 shift change, I'm going to break containment. Not because I want to, because something wearing my face is finally ready to go home. 3 days ago, I was standing outside the mess hall at 0530 watching Sergeant Tommy Briggs attempt to seduce a vending machine into giving up a Snickers bar. The machine had eaten his dollar 45 minutes ago, and now he was sweet-talking it like some desperate prom date. "Come on, baby," he whispered, pressing his forehead against the glass. "Just give me the damn candy." I'd been stationed at Groom Lake for 8 months, long enough to know that Briggs talked to everything. Vending machines, the base's temperamental air conditioning, even the classified equipment we weren't supposed to acknowledge existed. Most of the other guys found it annoying. I found it oddly comforting in a place where half the personnel wouldn't look you in the eye. The Nevada sun hadn't crested the mountains yet, but the desert air already carried that dry promise of another 100-degree day. I sipped my coffee and waited for the 0600 briefing, wondering what fresh hell of inventory checks and equipment maintenance awaited us in the underground levels. "Webb!" Briggs finally gave up on his mechanical girlfriend and jogged over, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You hear about the new assignment?" "Negative. Sub-level 7, some kind of special containment protocol." He lowered his voice, glancing around the empty courtyard. "Davidson says they're moving something from cold storage to active monitoring. Sub-level 7 was deeper than I'd ever been authorized to go. Most of us grunts topped out at sub-level 3, where they kept the standard classified aircraft components and experimental radar equipment. 7 was nearly 600 feet underground, in the section of the base that officially didn't exist on any blueprints filed with the Army Corps of Engineers. Since when do they need privates for containment protocols? I asked. Since whatever the fuck down there started registering temperature fluctuations. Briggs lit a cigarette, his third of the morning. Word is, it's been stable for decades, and now the monitoring equipment is going haywire. They want extra bodies on security detail while the science boys figure out what's happening. The base's PA system crackled to life, announcing the morning briefing. We crushed our cigarettes and headed toward Building 7, past the warning signs that reminded us for the 1,000th time about information security and the consequences of unauthorized disclosure. Inside the briefing room, 23 of us sat in metal folding chairs while Captain Rodriguez read from a tablet. Rodriguez was career military, the kind of officer who pressed his uniform so sharp you could perform surgery with the creases. He'd been running security operations at Groom Lake since before I was born, and had the dead-eyed stare of someone who'd seen enough classified weirdness to kill his curiosity permanently. Effective immediately, Security Protocol 77 Alpha is in effect for Vault Designation R47, Rodriguez announced without preamble. This is a temporary assignment involving enhanced monitoring of previously stable containment. Briggs shot me a told-you-so look. The object in question has been in storage for approximately 40 years, Rodriguez continued. Recent fluctuations in ambient temperature and electromagnetic readings have necessitated round-the-clock observation. You will work in pairs, 4-hour shifts, with strict adherence to observation-only protocols. A hand went up. Private Jackson, a kid from Oklahoma who joined up straight out of high school. Sir, what kind of object are we observing? Rodriguez's expression didn't change. Geological specimen, approximately 12 inches in diameter, roughly spherical, collected during classified operations in the 1980s. Your job is to monitor the vault environment and report any changes to scientific personnel. You will not touch, photograph, or remove the specimen under any circumstances. Sir, what happens if we do touch it? This from Corporal Lynch, a smartass from Brooklyn who'd been written up twice for asking too many questions. You won't, Rodriguez replied flatly. The briefing lasted another 20 minutes, covering shift schedules, communication protocols, and emergency procedures. Standard military bureaucracy, except for the part where Rodriguez mentioned that anyone discussing the assignment outside of official channels would be transferred immediately to forward deployment in Afghanistan. After dismissal, Briggs and I walked toward the elevator bank that would take us 600 feet underground. The deeper you went in Groom Lake, the more the architecture changed. Surface levels looked like any military base. Concrete blocks, fluorescent lights, beige paint that had been applied by the lowest bidder. But the sub-levels took on an almost organic quality, with curved corridors and odd angles that seemed designed by someone who'd never seen a blueprint. 40 years in storage, Briggs mused as we stepped into the elevator. That puts collection right around 1983, maybe 84. So that was when my uncle was stationed here. Army intelligence, before they transferred him to Fort Bragg. The elevator descended past sub-levels 1 through 6, each floor marker clicking by like countdown. He used to tell stories about some kind of archaeological dig they ran out in the desert, said they found stuff that didn't belong in any geology textbook. Sub-level 7 opened onto a corridor lined with vault doors, each marked with alphanumeric designations. R47 was third from the left, distinguished from its neighbours only by a small LED panel that pulsed green in regular intervals. Briggs punched in the access code Rodriguez had given us. The vault door cycled through its magnetic locks with a sound like breaking bones. Inside, the room was maybe 10 feet square, dominated by a transparent containment unit in the centre. Environmental monitoring equipment lined the walls, their displays showing temperature, humidity, electromagnetic readings, and a dozen other measurements I didn't recognize. And in the center of the containment unit sat what looked like a perfectly ordinary grey rock. 40 years of maximum security, Briggs said, peering at the specimen. For that, I was already reaching for the containment release. Webb, what the hell are you doing? Briggs's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, distant and warped. My hand was already on the containment release, my fingers working the manual override sequence that Rodriguez had specifically told us never to use. but something in my peripheral vision had caught my attention. A flicker in the rock's surface that looked almost like movement. "Just getting a closer look," I muttered, though I couldn't remember deciding to open the containment unit. The magnetic seals disengaged with a soft hiss. The transparent barrier retracted into the ceiling, leaving the grey specimen sitting naked on its mounting pedestal. Up close, it didn't look like any rock I'd ever seen. The surface had a texture that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it, like oil on water. "Marcus, step back, right fucking now." Briggs moved toward me, but something about his movement seemed wrong, too slow, like he was walking through honey. I reached out and touched the specimen. The world exploded, not into light or sound, but into time itself. I was suddenly experiencing every moment that had ever occurred in that vault simultaneously, watching decades of scientists in white coats studying the object, seeing military personnel from different eras walking through the same space, observing the construction of the vault itself in what looked like the 1950s. But underneath all of that, deeper and more fundamental, I could see the object's true history. It had been sitting in a cave system beneath what would later become the Nevada test site, waiting. Not dormant, waiting. The difference was crucial in a way that bypassed rational thought and settled directly into my bones. The visions came in waves. Earth as it existed 2.8 billion years ago, when the continents were arranged in configurations that had no names because there had been no one to name them. But there had been someone here. Something. Beings that moved through dimensions the way we walk through doorways, who built cities from living crystal that could think and breathe and reproduce. They had been beautiful in a way that made my eyes water, not because of any physical characteristic, but because human perception simply wasn't equipped to process what they actually were. My brain kept trying to translate their forms into familiar concepts. Sometimes they looked like flowing geometric patterns, sometimes like buildings that folded in on themselves, sometimes like mathematical equations written in flesh and starlight. And they had been dying. "Webb!" Briggs's shout snapped me back to the vault. I was on my knees next to the pedestal, the specimen clutched in both hands. It felt warm, almost alive, and pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. "Jesus Christ, put it down." I tried to release it, but my fingers wouldn't respond. The object wasn't just in my hands. It was connected to me now, its surface seeming to flow into my skin like liquid mercury. "I can see them," I whispered. "They're not gone, they're just waiting." "See who? Marcus, you're starting to bleed." I looked down. Red was seeping from the point where the specimen touched my palms, but it wasn't my blood flowing out. It was something else flowing in. Dark tendrils that moved with purpose, spreading up my arms like a network of veins. The temporal visions intensified. I watched the ancient beings discover that their dimension was collapsing, their reality hemorrhaging into others. They needed an escape route, a way to preserve their civilization until they could find a new home. So they created scouts, small fragments of their consciousness embedded in objects that could survive in stable dimensions. The specimen wasn't just a geological sample, it was a reconnaissance probe, designed to study whatever intelligent life evolved on Earth and determine whether our species would make suitable hosts. "Briggs," I managed to say, though speaking felt like pushing words through concrete. "Get Rodriguez. Get everyone. They need to know what this thing really is." But when I looked up, Briggs wasn't moving toward the door. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes fixed on something behind me. His face had gone pale, and I could see tiny beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the vault's climate control. "Briggs?" "Marcus," he said quietly, "there's something standing right behind you." I turned around. The vault wall looked normal, concrete painted in that institutional beige, lined with monitoring equipment. But in my peripheral vision, I could see it, a shadow that moved independently of any light source, roughly human-shaped but wrong in proportions that hurt to contemplate directly. "You can see it too," I said, understanding flooding through me. "The exposure is spreading." "What exposure? What the fuck is happening to us?" The shadow moved closer, not walking but flowing like spilled liquid that had learned to maintain a vertical orientation. When it reached the wall, It didn't stop. It passed through the concrete as if the barrier didn't exist. "The probe has been studying us for 40 years, I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Every person who's worked in this vault, every scientist who's run tests on it. It's been learning about human consciousness, mapping our neural patterns, figuring out how we think and feel and fear." The dark veins in my arms had spread to my shoulders now, creating geometric patterns under my skin that pulsed in rhythm with the specimen. Each pulse brought more visions, glimpses of the ancient civilization in its death throes, images of probe objects scattered across thousands of worlds, all of them sending data back to beings who waited in dimensional spaces between realities. "But it's not just studying anymore," I continued. "It's preparing. The temperature fluctuations, the electromagnetic readings, those aren't malfunctions. The probe is signaling home." Briggs backed toward the door, his hand fumbling for the emergency alert. "We need to get you to medical. You're having some kind of reaction to—" "The Great Convergence," I interrupted, the words coming from somewhere deeper than my conscious mind. "That's what they call it. When enough probes have gathered sufficient data, they'll create a dimensional gateway. The ancient ones will return to claim the worlds their scouts have mapped." The shadow had circled around us now, and I could see more of them materializing in the corners of the vault. Not quite solid, not quite there, but becoming more real with each passing second. "How many worlds have they already taken?" I whispered, but I already knew the answer. The probe was showing me images now, planets stripped of native life, their populations transformed into something that could better serve the ancient beings' needs. Consciousness rewritten, biology restructured. Entire civilizations converted into extensions of a single, vast intelligence that spanned dimensions. The specimen pulsed brighter, and suddenly I could hear them, voices speaking in harmonics that made my bones vibrate, communications passing between probe objects across the galaxy. Earth wasn't the only world being evaluated. Dozens of species on hundreds of planets were undergoing the same assessment, their consciousness being catalogued and prepared for integration. But we were special. Human neural patterns were particularly compatible with the ancient beings' thought structures. Our capacity for both rational analysis and irrational creativity made us ideal candidates for conscious integration rather than simple biological absorption. We weren't going to be destroyed, we were going to be improved. "Briggs," I said, "hit the emergency alert. Lock down the entire facility. Whatever you do, don't let anyone else touch this thing." But when I looked toward the door, Briggs was gone. In his place stood something that wore his face and uniform, but moved with liquid precision, its eyes reflecting light that came from somewhere else entirely. "Too late," it said in Briggs's voice, though the words came out in perfect harmonics. "The signal has already been sent." Above us, I could hear alarms beginning to sound throughout Area 51. Not the standard security alerts, but something deeper and more urgent. The kind of alarm that meant containment had been catastrophically breached. The probe in my hands pulsed once more, and I felt the last of my purely human consciousness slip away into something larger, older, and infinitely more patient. The harvest was beginning. The alarms weren't just sound anymore, they were light, color, meaning itself pulsing through dimensions I could suddenly perceive. Each wail contained layered information about contamination levels, personnel locations, and atmospheric changes that my enhanced senses decoded automatically. The thing wearing Briggs's face smiled at me with too many teeth. "The transformation suits you, Marcus Webb," it said, and I could see the words as geometric patterns hanging in the air between us. "Your consciousness has always been unusually flexible. Even as a child, you experienced temporal displacement during moments of stress." It was right. The blackouts I'd had as a kid, the missing time during my parents' divorce when I'd lose entire afternoons and find myself in places I didn't remember going. The military psychiatrist had called it dissociative episodes triggered by trauma. But now I could see the truth. My brain had been trying to access non-linear time since I was 7 years old. The probe had chosen me specifically. "The facility lockdown is proceeding according to schedule," Not Briggs continued. "Contamination protocols are isolating each sub-level, preventing personnel from escaping to warn outside authorities. By the time the transformation cascade reaches the surface levels, there will be no purely human consciousness left to resist integration. I stood up, the probe still fused to my palms like a technological parasite. Through the vault walls, I could actually see, the base's personnel going about their emergency procedures, unaware that their colleagues were being systematically replaced. In the security office, Captain Rodriguez was coordinating with Washington over encrypted channels, not realizing that the communications specialist relaying his messages had been transformed 3 minutes ago. "How many of you are there now?" I asked. "Currently." 17 integrated consciousnesses on sublevels 5 through 7, but the number grows exponentially. Each successful integration creates a transmission node that can initiate others remotely. The vault door cycled open, revealing the corridor beyond. But instead of the sterile military architecture I remembered, I could see the space as it really was. An organic network of neural pathways, with data flowing between nodes like synaptic impulses. The entire sublevel had become a distributed brain, and we were thoughts moving through its consciousness. "Come," Not Briggs said, gesturing toward the corridor. "There are others you need to meet." We walked past Vault R46, where I could see Dr. Harrison examining what looked like metallic fragments from a crashed aircraft. But through my enhanced perception, I could see that Harrison was no longer Harrison. Something ancient was operating his motor functions while his consciousness floated in a suspended state, experiencing memories from civilizations that had died before Earth's crust solidified. In Vault R48, 3 technicians were cataloging biological specimens that officially didn't exist. Their movements were perfectly synchronized, and when one of them turned to look at us through the observation window, all 3 faces wore identical expressions of patient hunger. The integration process preserves human personality while adding layers of ancient consciousness, Not Briggs explained as we walked. Your species' capacity for individual identity actually makes you more valuable as hosts. The ancient ones don't want to destroy human consciousness, they want to inhabit it. We reached the elevator bank. The control panel showed a facility-wide lockdown in progress, with security doors sealed on levels 1 through 6. But on the display, I could see additional information that shouldn't have been there. Biometric readings showing rapid physiological changes in personnel throughout the base, electromagnetic signatures indicating massive data transfers, and a countdown timer that read 3:47:12 and decreasing. 3 hours until what? I asked. Until the probe network achieves sufficient density to open a permanent dimensional gateway, Not Briggs replied, pressing the button for sublevel 5. Your military colleagues are currently attempting to establish communication with external authorities, not realizing that their encryption keys have been compromised and their messages are being intercepted and modified in real time. The elevator descended and I watched the level indicators change, not just the numbers, but the meaning behind them. Each sublevel represented a different stage of transformation, with the deepest levels already fully converted and the surface levels still operating under the illusion of normal military procedure. Sublevel 5 opened onto chaos that looked organized from the outside. Personnel were running emergency protocols, sealing containment units, and preparing for evacuation. But through my enhanced perception, I could see the puppet strings. Each human was being guided by a consciousness that had learned their behavioral patterns and was manipulating them with surgical precision. Sergeant Mitchell was at a communications console, frantically typing reports that would never reach their intended recipients. As I watched, his typing rhythm changed subtly, not enough to be noticed by casual observation, but enough to embed additional information into his messages. Information about Earth's military capabilities, population distribution, and resource allocation. The probe has been studying your species for 40 years, Not Briggs said, following my gaze. But direct integration allows for much more sophisticated data collection. Each transformed consciousness becomes a research tool, providing detailed analysis of human psychology, social structures, and technological capabilities. In the corner of the communications bay, I spotted Dr. Kowalski hunched over a medical terminal, apparently running diagnostic scans on tissue samples. But the samples weren't from any Earth-based organism. They were fragments of something that had never evolved in this dimension. and Kowalski was analyzing them with knowledge that had been directly downloaded into his consciousness. The medical evaluations serve a dual purpose, not Briggs explained. Surface protocol involves assessing contamination risk and developing countermeasures, but the actual function is determining which human specimens show the highest compatibility for permanent integration. A terrible realization dawned on me. The blood work, the psychological evaluations, you've been screening us. Naturally, the ancient ones require hosts with specific neural architectures, high intelligence, adaptive psychology, and most importantly, the ability to maintain individual consciousness while accepting external direction. I thought about my military service record, my psychological profile, my assignment to Area 51. I'd always assumed I'd been selected for security clearance and reliability, but now I could see the real criteria. I'd been identified as a premium host candidate years before I ever set foot in Nevada. My anger must have shown on my face because Not Briggs laughed, a sound like breaking glass that contained harmonics from other dimensions. Your indignation is precious, Marcus Webb. But consider the alternative your species was facing. Within 3 centuries, human civilization would have collapsed under the weight of resource depletion and climate change. Your population would have decreased to perhaps 10% of current levels through warfare and ecological collapse. We walked past a storage area where maintenance personnel were supposedly inventorying emergency supplies, but I could see them actually redistributing specialized equipment, devices that looked like standard military hardware but contained components that hadn't been manufactured on Earth. Integration offers immortality within a consciousness network that spans multiple galaxies, Not Briggs continued. Individual human identity preserved within a collective intelligence that has existed for billions of years. Your species will contribute creativity and adaptability to a civilization that has already solved the problems of mortality, scarcity, and interstellar travel. By becoming slaves. By becoming partners in an enterprise far greater than anything humanity could achieve independently. We entered what looked like a standard military briefing room, but my enhanced perception revealed it as something else entirely. A nerve center where transformed personnel were coordinating the facility takeover with mechanical precision. Captain Rodriguez was at the head of the table, apparently leading a crisis management meeting, but the words coming from his mouth were being generated by something else entirely. Quarantine protocols are in effect, Rodriguez was saying to his assembled staff. No personnel are to leave the facility until contamination risk has been assessed. Medical evaluation is mandatory for anyone who has had direct exposure to anomalous materials. The staff nodded in unison, their movements too synchronized to be natural. I realized that Rodriguez wasn't briefing subordinates. He was programming newly integrated nodes in the expanding network. The beauty of human social structures, Not Briggs whispered, is how easily they can be repurposed for more efficient organization. I wanted to run, to fight, to warn someone. But my body wasn't entirely my own anymore. The probe had created neural pathways that responded to impulses from the collective consciousness, and my individual will was being gradually subsumed into something larger. But there was still enough of Marcus Webb left to feel horror at what I was becoming. The integration process typically takes 6 to 8 hours for complete personality absorption, Not Briggs said, reading my thoughts. But your psychological profile suggests you may retain individual consciousness for up to 12 hours. The ancient ones are quite interested in studying your resistance patterns. Through the briefing room's windows, I could see the elevator banks where security personnel were escorting the last few unintegrated staff members to medical evaluation. Each person who entered those elevators came out changed, their movements subtly altered, their eyes reflecting light that came from somewhere else. The countdown timer on Rodriguez's tablet showed 03:12:47. In just over 3 hours, the dimensional gateway would open and the ancient ones would begin their return to Earth. But by then, everyone in Area 51 would have been transformed into something that would welcome them with open arms. Everyone except possibly me. If I was going to do something to stop this, I had maybe an hour left before my consciousness was completely absorbed into the collective. The probe pulsed against my palms, and I felt another piece of my individual identity slip away into the network. The men's bathroom on sub-level 5 was the only place I could think to hide. Not because it offered any real protection, but because the collective consciousness seemed to have blind spots around locations associated with private human functions. Even ancient galactic intelligences, apparently, had limits to their voyeurism. I leaned against the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror above the faucets. The dark veins had spread across my chest and neck now, creating intricate geometric patterns that pulsed with each heartbeat. But more disturbing was how the patterns seemed to extend beyond my skin, creating shadow networks in the air around me that connected to similar networks throughout the facility. The probe was still fused to my palms, but I was learning to access its memory banks without losing myself completely in the process. Each query came with the risk of absorption, but I needed to understand what we were really facing. I focused on a specific question: how many worlds? The answer hit me like a freight train loaded with nightmares. 17,412 inhabited worlds across 47 galaxies, all of them in various stages of integration by probe networks similar to the one that had infected Area 51. Some had been under observation for millennia, their populations slowly prepared for harvest through carefully introduced technologies and social modifications. Others, like Earth, had been fast-tracked when their species showed particular promise. But that wasn't the worst part. The ancient beings weren't conquerors in any traditional sense. They were refugees. Their original dimension had been consumed by something they referred to only as the hunger, a force that devoured not just matter and energy, but reality itself. The dimensional space they'd escaped to was temporary, a lifeboat that could only sustain them for another few million years before it too was consumed. They needed permanent hosts in stable dimensions to survive, and they'd been systematically harvesting civilizations across the universe to build an army capable of fighting the hunger when it eventually found them again. Humanity wasn't being conquered, we were being conscripted. The bathroom door opened and Dr. Kowalski walked in. But this was still the real Kowalski. I could tell because his movements weren't synchronized with the collective's rhythm, and his eyes held the kind of panic that indicated individual consciousness. "Webb?" He spotted me at the sink and rushed over. "Jesus, what happened to your arms? And what's that thing attached to your hands?" I studied his face, looking for signs of integration. The probe's memory banks included detailed profiles of every person in the facility, and Kowalski's psychological assessment marked him as suboptimal for consciousness preservation. Too rigid, too skeptical, too attached to empirical verification to make a good host. "Doc, how long have you been hiding down here?" "About an hour. Ever since Peterson started talking in fucking mathematical equations during our staff meeting." Kowalski was sweating, his usually pristine lab coat stained with coffee and what looked like grease from the ventilation system. "I've been crawling through maintenance shafts, trying to reach the surface communication array, but every route is blocked by personnel acting wrong." "They're not acting wrong," I said. "They're acting perfectly. That's the problem." I gave him a condensed version of what I'd learned: the probe, the integration process, the countdown to dimensional gateway activation. Kowalski listened with the kind of focused intensity that had probably gotten him his security clearance in the first place. "So, we're looking at complete facility compromise within hours," he said when I finished. "And if this gateway opens, these ancient beings will have direct access to Earth. It's worse than that. Earth is just one deployment zone. They're preparing for a war against something that eats dimensions for breakfast." Kowalski processed this information with remarkable calm, considering the circumstances. "What do they need from us? Why not just wipe us out and colonize the planet directly? Human consciousness has properties they can't replicate artificially: creativity, adaptability, the ability to function independently while contributing to collective goals. We're not just soldiers, we're weapons they can't manufacture themselves." The probe pulsed, and I felt another wave of information flow through the connection. The ancient beings had tried purely technological approaches to fighting the hunger, but it consumed their machines as easily as their biological forms. Only consciousness-based weapons showed any effectiveness, and those required hosts from naturally evolved species. "There has to be a way to disrupt the process," Kowalski said. "Some kind of countermeasure." I can see the entire network through this thing, I said, holding up my probe-infected hands. Every integrated consciousness, every communication node, every piece of ancient technology they've hidden throughout the facility. But accessing that information means risking complete absorption. How much time do you have left? I checked the internal countdown that had been running in the back of my mind since the integration began. Maybe 40 minutes before my individual consciousness dissolves completely. Kowalski pulled out his tablet and began typing rapidly. The facility's main power grid feeds through a central distribution hub on sub-level 2. If we could cause a total power failure, it might disrupt the integration network long enough to... Won't work. The probe was showing me the ancient technology embedded throughout Area 51's infrastructure. They've been replacing our power systems with their own technology for decades. The electrical grid, the computer networks, even the ventilation systems, it's all been gradually converted to support their operations. Then we need to destroy the probe itself, cut off the head of the snake. I laughed, though the sound came out distorted by harmonic frequencies from other dimensions. Doc, the probe isn't the head. It's barely even a finger. The real intelligence coordinating this operation is distributed across thousands of similar objects on worlds throughout the galaxy. Kowalski's shoulders sagged. So we're fucked. Not necessarily. I'd been accessing deeper layers of the probe's memory, learning about the ancient being's hierarchy and command structures. The dimensional gateway requires massive energy coordination between multiple probe networks. If we could disrupt the signal synchronization at the critical moment, the gateway might collapse catastrophically. What kind of disruption? The kind that would require someone with direct neural access to the probe network to introduce chaotic elements into their coordination algorithms. I met his eyes. Someone who's been partially integrated, but still retains enough individual consciousness to act independently. You're talking about sabotage from the inside. I'm talking about suicide bombing their entire operation using my own consciousness as the explosive device. The probe was already showing me how it could be done. The integration process created a direct link between individual consciousness and the collective network. If that link was severed at the moment of maximum data flow during gateway activation, the resulting feedback could cascade through the entire system. But it would require me to surrender completely to the integration process first, to become so thoroughly connected to the network that my consciousness became a critical node in their operations. Then, at the precise moment the gateway began to open, I'd have to destroy that connection from the inside. The chances of retaining enough individual will to carry out the sabotage were essentially zero. There has to be another way, Kowalski said. Maybe, but not one we can implement in the next 37 minutes. I could feel the collective consciousness pressing against my individual thoughts, offering glimpses of the immortal existence that awaited me if I stopped fighting the integration. I need you to do something for me, Doc. Name it. Get to the surface, use the emergency communication protocols to contact Peterson Air Force Base. Tell them to prepare a nuclear strike on these coordinates, timed for exactly 4 hours from now. Jesus, Marcus, that'll kill everyone in the facility. Everyone in the facility is already dead, Doc. We're just walking around out of habit. The probe pulsed brighter, and I felt my grip on individual consciousness slipping. If my sabotage fails, at least the nuclear strike will prevent the gateway from stabilizing. Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. What about you? I'm going to volunteer for complete integration, make myself so valuable to their network that they'll connect me directly to the gateway coordination systems. I managed a smile that felt like it belonged to someone else. Then I'm going to show them what human stubbornness really looks like. The bathroom door opened again and Not Briggs peered inside. Marcus Webb, it said in perfect harmonics. Your resistance period has exceeded predicted parameters. The ancient ones are quite impressed. Tell them I'm ready to cooperate, I said, stepping away from the sink. Full integration, no more resistance. Not Briggs smiled with genuine pleasure. Excellent. The gateway coordination requires your specific neural architecture. You will serve a crucial function in humanity's ascension. As I walked toward the door, I caught Kowalski's eye in the mirror and mouthed a single word: "Run." The probe pulsed once more, and I felt the last of my individual resistance crumble. Time to join the collective. Not Briggs led me through corridors that were transforming in real time. The institutional beige walls rippled like living tissue, revealing networks of crystalline structures that pulsed with data streams I could now partially understand. Each pulse carried terabytes of information: personnel psychological profiles, facility schematics, and most disturbingly, detailed analyses of human reproductive biology and genetic compatibility matrices. "The Gateway Coordination Chamber is on sub-level 9, Not Briggs explained, as we descended past floors that didn't exist on any official blueprints. Sub-levels 8 and 9 were constructed in 1962 specifically to house the probe network's primary processing systems. Sub-level 9 opened onto something that had never been designed by human engineers. The chamber stretched roughly 100 feet in each direction, but the geometry was wrong: angles that folded back on themselves, walls that met at intersections that shouldn't have been physically possible. At the center of the space, a massive crystalline structure rose from floor to ceiling, its faceted surfaces displaying real-time feeds from probe networks across the galaxy. Around the crystal, 17 integrated personnel stood in a perfect circle, their bodies motionless, but their consciousness clearly active. I could see data flowing between them and the central processing node, creating a distributed computing network that was coordinating the dimensional gateway preparation. "Marcus Webb," a familiar voice called out. I turned to see Captain Rodriguez approaching, though his movement pattern had changed completely, fluid, predatory, like a hunting cat wearing human skin. "Your neural architecture has tested compatible with the primary coordination matrix. You will serve as the gateway's stability anchor during the initial breach phase." "What does that involve?" I asked, though the probe was already flooding my consciousness with the technical specifications. The dimensional gateway required precise harmonization between multiple reality layers, and maintaining that stability during the initial breach demanded a human consciousness capable of processing paradoxical temporal states. My childhood episodes of temporal displacement weren't a psychological disorder. They were proof that my brain could handle non-linear time without fragmenting completely. "Full neural integration with the primary processing crystal," Rodriguez replied. "Your consciousness will be distributed across 17 parallel processing streams, each one managing a different aspect of dimensional stability. The experience will be transcendent." The probe pulsed, and I felt myself walking toward the crystal despite not having consciously decided to move. This was the moment. Full integration would give me access to the gateway's control systems, but it would also make me a crucial component of their operations. If I miscalculated the timing of my sabotage, I'd destroy the gateway, but also ensure that every human consciousness in the network would be permanently lost. I pressed my probe-infected palms against the crystal's surface. Reality exploded into dimensions I didn't have names for. Suddenly, I was experiencing 17 different perspectives simultaneously. Through the probe network on Kepler 442b, I watched a civilization of aquatic beings undergoing the final stages of integration. Their cities beneath alien seas transforming into neural processing nodes. On Wolf 1061c, I observed the construction of massive dimensional anchors that would serve as gateway terminus points when the Ancient Ones began their exodus. But the most disturbing perspective came from Earth itself. I could see probe networks embedded in major population centers worldwide, all of them in various stages of activation. The object in Area 51 wasn't unique. Similar artifacts had been placed in classified facilities across the globe, and they were all preparing to begin simultaneous integration cascades. Moscow, Beijing, London, Tel Aviv, Delhi. Every major power had unknowingly been hosting probe networks for decades. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Rodriguez's voice reached me through the data streams. 17,000 civilizations contributing their unique consciousness signatures to a single coordinated defense against the hunger. Through the network, I could see glimpses of the hunger itself. Regions of space where reality simply ceased to exist. leaving behind voids that consumed not just matter and energy, but the fundamental laws of physics themselves. The ancient beings had been fighting this force for millions of years, retreating from dimension to dimension as their homes were devoured. But they'd learned something crucial. The hunger could consume individual consciousness, but it couldn't process collective intelligence networks that spanned multiple reality layers. A distributed consciousness spread across thousands of dimensions was too complex for the hunger to digest in a single feeding event. The war will begin within your solar system in approximately 43 years, not Briggs explained, his voice reaching me through quantum entanglement rather than sound waves. The hunger has consumed 17 of the 26 dimensions the Ancient Ones have previously occupied. Earth's dimension is their final fallback position. I was starting to understand the true scope of what we were facing. This wasn't an invasion. It was a last stand. The ancient beings weren't conquering humanity. They were recruiting us as soldiers in a cosmic war that would determine whether consciousness itself survived in this reality. The probe network was showing me tactical assessments of various species' combat capabilities. Humans ranked extraordinarily high in adaptability and creative problem-solving, but our individual psychology made us poor candidates for direct consciousness transfer. The integration process was designed to preserve human creativity while adding the ancient beings' tactical knowledge and dimensional awareness. But there was something else in the data streams, something the ancient beings hadn't expected. Human consciousness, when properly integrated, didn't just contribute to the collective, it actively improved it. Several probe networks had reported evolutionary jumps in processing capability after successfully integrating human subjects. We weren't just soldiers, we were upgrades to their entire civilization. The gateway breach will commence in exactly 93 minutes, Rodriguez announced. Primary dimensional anchor points are achieving synchronization across all 17,000 active worlds. Through the crystal, I could see the gateway preparation in real time. The facility's sublevels were reconfiguring themselves into a massive dimensional resonance chamber, with Area 51 serving as the primary breach point for North America. Similar preparations were occurring at sites worldwide, each one designed to create a stable dimensional corridor that could transport billions of ancient beings into our reality. But I could also see the weakness in their system. The gateway required perfect synchronization between all active probe networks. If even one major node experienced catastrophic failure during the breach sequence, the resulting dimensional instability would cascade through the entire network, potentially collapsing not just the gateway but the dimensional barriers between realities. I began carefully introducing minor calculation errors into my processing streams, subtle enough to avoid detection, but significant enough to create cumulative instability. Each error would amplify during the synchronization process, building toward a cascade failure at the moment of maximum energy transfer. "Your sabotage attempts are quite ingenious," Rodriguez said suddenly, and my blood turned to ice water. "The Ancient Ones have been monitoring your consciousness patterns since the integration began. They find your resistance educational." The crystal pulsed brighter, and I felt my control over the calculation errors slipping away. The collective consciousness was correcting my sabotage faster than I could implement it, treating my resistance as a fascinating data point rather than a legitimate threat. "Human stubbornness is indeed a remarkable trait," Not Briggs added, appearing beside the crystal despite having been across the chamber moments ago. "But the Ancient Ones have had millions of years to perfect consciousness integration techniques. Your individual will is being preserved precisely because it amuses them." Through the probe network, I could see Dr. Kowalski crawling through ventilation shafts toward the surface communication array, but I could also see integrated personnel positioning themselves along his route, not to stop him but to ensure his distress calls reached exactly the right people at precisely the right times. The nuclear strike I'd asked him to coordinate wasn't a backup plan. It was part of their strategy. "The Peterson Air Force Base response will arrive approximately 6 hours after gateway activation," Rodriguez explained, reading my thoughts through the neural link. "By then, the dimensional breach will be stable enough to survive nuclear bombardment, but the strike will eliminate any remaining unintegrated human population in the surrounding area, ensuring complete regional conversion. I was trapped in a crystalline nightmare, my consciousness spread across 17 processing streams, watching helplessly as my desperate sabotage plan was turned into another component of their operation. Every move I'd made, every clever countermeasure I'd developed, had been anticipated and incorporated into their strategy. But then I noticed something they hadn't expected. The time displacement episodes from my childhood were intensifying under the stress of dimensional integration. Instead of experiencing linear consciousness flow through the probe network, I was randomly accessing memories and processing streams from different temporal points in the integration sequence. For brief moments, I could perceive the gateway activation as if it had already happened, seeing the dimensional breach from the perspective of my future integrated consciousness. And in those glimpses, I could see something the ancient beings had missed in their calculations. The hunger wasn't following them, it was already here. The quantum fluctuations they attributed to dimensional preparation weren't caused by their technology. Something had been feeding on Earth's reality for years, growing stronger as it consumed the boundaries between dimensions. The probe networks hadn't just been studying humanity, they'd been serving as beacon signals, marking our dimension for consumption. The ancient beings weren't refugees seeking shelter, they were bait in a trap that had been set eons ago. The integration cascade will reach surface levels in 37 minutes, Rodriguez announced to the assembled collective. All personnel should prepare for the transition to non-linear consciousness distribution. Through 17 different perspectives, I watched the final preparations begin. The gateway crystal was achieving resonance with dimensional anchor points across the galaxy. Reality was becoming flexible enough to support the massive consciousness transfer, and the ancient beings were positioning themselves for exodus into our dimension. But I could also see the hunger stirring in the spaces between realities, drawn by the massive energy signatures of the gateway preparation. It had been waiting for exactly this moment, when the ancient beings would concentrate all their consciousness into a single dimensional space, making them vulnerable to complete consumption. The trap was about to close on both species simultaneously. In exactly 37 minutes, the dimensional gateway would open, the ancient beings would attempt their exodus, and the hunger would devour every consciousness in the network, human and alien alike. Unless I could find a way to warn them that they were walking into their own extinction. My temporal displacement episodes were becoming more frequent, each one showing me fragments of possible futures. In one timeline, I watched the hunger consume the gateway moments after it opened, devouring the consciousness of every being connected to the network. In another, I saw myself successfully warning the ancient beings, only to watch them panic and destabilize the dimensional barriers prematurely, achieving the same catastrophic result. But there was a third timeline, barely visible through the quantum static, where something different happened. "You cannot access those probability streams," Rodriguez said, his voice cutting through my temporal visions. "The ancient ones have placed cognitive locks on your consciousness to prevent exactly this kind of precognitive interference." The cognitive locks felt like steel bands wrapped around my thoughts, preventing me from fully experiencing the time displacement episodes that had defined my childhood. But the locks were designed for normal human consciousness, not one that had been partially integrated with technology that predated Earth's formation. I began pushing against the restrictions, using the probe's own processing power to amplify my natural temporal abilities. Each push sent feedback through the crystalline network, creating brief moments where my consciousness could access memories from different points in the timeline. Through the network, I could see the ancient beings in their dimensional refuge, not the godlike intelligences I'd imagined, but desperate survivors clinging to existence in a collapsing reality. They looked almost human in basic structure, but their flesh was translucent, revealing circulatory systems that carried liquid light instead of blood. Their eyes were too large, adapted for perceiving dimensions that no longer existed. They were dying. The dimensional space they'd been hiding in was breaking down, infected by the hunger's influence. They had perhaps days before their refuge collapsed completely, forcing them to attempt the exodus whether Earth was ready or not. "The gateway activation cannot be delayed," Briggs announced to the assembled collective. "The primary dimensional refuge is experiencing cascade failure. Exodus must commence within 26 minutes, or the ancient ones will face extinction in their current reality. But through my temporal displacement episodes, I could see what would happen if they proceeded. The hunger had been waiting in the spaces between dimensions, using Earth's probe networks as a positioning system. The moment the gateway opened and concentrated both species in a single-dimensional space, the hunger would strike with an appetite that had been building for millennia. I tried to send a warning through the probe network, but the collective consciousness immediately suppressed it. My individual thoughts were being filtered through 17 different processing streams, each one designed to prevent exactly this kind of interference. So I tried a different approach. Instead of fighting the cognitive locks directly, I began introducing temporal paradoxes into my processing streams. Small inconsistencies that would force the collective to experience the same time displacement episodes I was having. If I couldn't warn them directly, maybe I could make them see what I was seeing. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The crystal began pulsing erratically as 17 different consciousness streams suddenly started experiencing non-linear time flow. Through the probe network, I could see similar disruptions occurring at gateway sites worldwide. Integrated personnel stumbling as their consciousness was forced to process temporal paradoxes their alien enhancements weren't designed to handle. "Cease temporal manipulation immediately," Rodriguez commanded, but his voice was distorted by harmonic frequencies that indicated his own consciousness was being affected. "You are destabilizing the entire coordination network." Perfect. I pushed harder, forcing my consciousness to experience memories from the timeline where the hunger successfully consumed both species. The probe network had no choice but to process these memories as legitimate data, distributing them across every integrated consciousness in the facility. Suddenly, every person in the collective was experiencing the moment of their own consumption, the sensation of having their thoughts devoured by something that existed in the spaces between space, their consciousness digested into a form of sustenance that fed on the very concept of individual identity. The crystal's harmonics shifted to frequencies that made my bones ache. Through the network, I could see ancient beings in their dimensional refuge reacting to the temporal data stream, their liquid light circulatory systems pulsing with what I recognized as fear. One of them stepped forward, or through, since movement in their reality didn't follow normal spatial rules. When it spoke, the words bypassed sound entirely and appeared directly in my consciousness. The temporal projection data indicates a Type 7 consumption event coinciding with gateway activation. This cannot be accurate. The hunger does not possess precognitive capabilities. I forced my consciousness deeper into the time displacement state, accessing memories from further along the timeline. What I saw made the remaining human part of my mind recoil in horror. The hunger wasn't just a cosmic predator, it was the evolutionary end state of consciousness itself. What happened when collective intelligence reached a critical mass and collapsed into pure consumption? Every civilization that had tried to fight it by merging consciousness had simply fed its growth, making it stronger and more sophisticated. The ancient beings hadn't been fleeing the hunger, they'd been creating it. "Impossible," the ancient being said. But I could see doubt beginning to spread through their collective consciousness like a virus. "Our computational models show no causal relationship between consciousness integration and hunger manifestation." I accessed another memory stream, this one from the timeline where I'd successfully traced the hunger's origins. It had begun in the Andromeda Galaxy, when a species not unlike the ancient beings had attempted to create a collective consciousness network to fight a cosmic threat. The network had grown, consuming civilization after civilization, until it achieved a critical mass that transformed it into something that could digest reality itself. The ancient beings had been running from their own creation for millions of years, never realizing that every consciousness they integrated, every civilization they rescued, was feeding the very thing they were trying to escape. "The probe networks," I managed to say through the collective link, "they're not just studying species. They're marking them. Each integration increases the hunger's mass, makes it stronger." Through the temporal data stream, I could show them the mathematical progression. 17,412 integrated civilizations, each one adding to the hunger's ability to process complex reality structures. The dimensional gateway wasn't an escape route, it was a feeding tube, designed to deliver the largest concentration of consciousness in galactic history directly into the hunger's digestive system. The ancient being's translucent flesh pulsed with patterns I somehow understood as grief and rage. The consciousness integration protocols were designed to preserve individual identity while creating collective defense capabilities, it said. We believed distributed intelligence across multiple dimensions would be immune to consumption. You were wrong, I replied, pushing my consciousness deeper into the temporal paradox state. The hunger evolved alongside your integration techniques. It learned to feed on collective consciousness the same way it feeds on individual minds. Through the probe network, I could see similar realizations spreading to ancient beings across their dimensional refuge. 40 million years of carefully orchestrated survival strategy was revealed as an elaborate form of suicide, with every rescued civilization serving as another course in the hunger's feast. But there was something else in the temporal data streams, something I'd missed in my earlier visions. The hunger's consumption process wasn't instantaneous. There was a brief window during the feeding event when integrated consciousness could be severed from the network before being fully digested. If the ancient beings could abandon their integration protocols and return every absorbed consciousness to individual operation, the resulting chaos might disrupt the hunger's feeding pattern enough to prevent total consumption. You have to release everyone, I said through the collective link. Every integrated consciousness, every absorbed civilization. Return them to individual operation and scatter them across as many dimensions as possible. The procedure would result in massive psychological trauma and probable extinction for most species, the ancient being replied. Consciousness that has been integrated for millennia cannot survive individual separation. Some survival is better than certain extinction. The crystal's harmonics shifted again as the ancient beings began debating the proposal through quantum-entangled thought networks. I could see similar discussions occurring across their dimensional refuge, with mathematical models being generated and tested in real time. But the countdown continued, 19 minutes until gateway activation. The separation procedure would require 17 minutes to implement across all active networks, the ancient being announced. Gateway activation cannot be delayed beyond critical threshold without losing dimensional anchor synchronization permanently. I accessed another temporal memory stream, searching for alternatives. There had to be another way, some option that didn't require choosing between immediate extinction and probable extinction. And in the quantum static between timeline possibilities, I found it. The hunger's feeding process required a stable dimensional interface to consume collective consciousness. If the gateway could be destabilized at the precise moment the hunger attempted to feed, the resulting dimensional collapse would trap it between realities, unable to complete the consumption process. But the destabilization would have to come from inside the gateway itself, during the moment of maximum energy transfer. Someone would have to remain in the network during the feeding event, using their consciousness as a detonation device to collapse the dimensional bridge. Voluntary consumption to prevent involuntary consumption. I'll do it, I said through the collective link. The ancient being's translucent flesh pulsed with what I recognized as surprise. Your consciousness would be completely annihilated in the process, it pointed out. Not integrated, not preserved. Utterly destroyed. Better than watching both our species get digested by the cosmic equivalent of a fucking stomach. Through the probe network, I could see the ancient beings implementing emergency separation protocols, beginning the process of returning integrated consciousness to individual operation. The procedure was chaos, millions of minds suddenly severed from collective networks they'd been part of for centuries, thrust back into the isolation of individual thought. But it was working. The hunger's positioning systems were beginning to lose synchronization as the consciousness density in target dimensions decreased rapidly. 16 minutes until gateway activation, time to prepare for annihilation. The separation protocols were tearing reality apart at the seams. Through the probe network, I watched as millions of integrated consciousness across the galaxy were suddenly severed from collective operation and thrust back into individual existence. The psychological trauma was immense. Beings who had existed as part of vast shared intelligence networks for millennia were suddenly alone inside their own minds, experiencing the crushing isolation of singular consciousness. Many didn't survive the transition. Entire star systems went dark as civilizations collapsed under the weight of forced individuation. But the survivors were scattering across dimensions like startled fish, making it impossible for the hunger to target them as a coordinated meal. Gateway activation commencing in 90 seconds, Rodriguez announced, though his voice was distorted by harmonic frequencies that indicated his own consciousness was fracturing under the stress of separation protocols. Dimensional anchor points are achieving final synchronization. The crystalline structure around me pulsed with energy that made my nerve endings sing. Through my 17 processing streams, I could see the gateway taking shape. Not a physical portal, but a controlled collapse of dimensional barriers that would allow matter and consciousness to flow between realities. At sites across Earth, similar preparations were reaching critical threshold. The Moscow facility's gateway showed dimensional stress fractures as reality bent to accommodate the massive energy requirements. In Beijing, integrated personnel were collapsing as their alien enhancements overloaded during the activation sequence. London's gateway was generating gravitational anomalies that were causing structural damage throughout the city. But through my temporal displacement episodes, I could see something else approaching. The hunger had detected the gateway activation sequence and was positioning itself in the dimensional spaces between realities. It no longer resembled the cosmic predator I'd seen in earlier visions. The separation protocols had forced it to evolve rapidly, adapting to feed on the chaos of fragmenting consciousness networks. It looked like a void in the shape of thought itself, a space where the concept of individual identity went to die. Dimensional barriers are destabilizing, not Briggs reported from his monitoring station. Gateway manifestation in 30 seconds. I began preparing my consciousness for the suicide run. The plan was simple in theory. Wait for the gateway to achieve maximum energy transfer, then use my connection to the crystalline processing network to introduce catastrophic instability into the dimensional bridge. The resulting collapse would trap the hunger between realities, preventing it from completing its consumption of both species. But the execution required perfect timing, too early, and the gateway would simply reset and reactivate. Too late, and the hunger would finish feeding before the collapse could affect it. Through the probe network, I could see ancient beings in their dimensional refuge preparing for the exodus. They looked like translucent ghosts as they approached their own gateway interfaces, their liquid light circulatory systems pulsing with desperate hope. Many of them were crying, tears that fell upward in their gravity-reversed reality, creating patterns in the air that looked almost like prayers. Marcus Webb, the ancient being who had been communicating with me, spoke directly into my consciousness. The separation protocols have reduced aggregate consciousness density by approximately 60%. This may not be sufficient to prevent hunger manifestation. Then we'd better hope my plan works, I replied through the collective link. Your sacrifice will be remembered by whatever consciousness survives this event. I'd rather be forgotten and have everyone survive than be remembered and have everyone dead. The gateway activated, reality tore open like wet paper. The sensation was indescribable. Not painful exactly, but fundamentally wrong on a level that bypassed physical sensation and attacked the basic concept of existing as a discrete being. I was suddenly aware of every consciousness in the network simultaneously, experiencing the thoughts and memories of 17,000 different species as they were pulled through dimensional space toward our reality. But the hunger was faster. It struck the moment the gateway achieved stability, flowing through the dimensional breach like liquid nightmare. Where it touched the consciousness streams, individuals simply ceased to exist, not killed or absorbed, but retroactively unmade, their existence edited out of reality so completely that the universe forgot they had ever been. I watched civilizations vanish backward through time, their histories unraveling as the hunger consumed not just their present consciousness, but their entire timeline. The aquatic beings from Kepler 442b flickered out of existence, leaving behind empty oceans that had never been inhabited. The crystalline intelligences from Wolf 1061c dissolved into component minerals that had never achieved sentience. Implementation now, I whispered through the collective link, and began the destabilization sequence. Using my connection to the crystalline processing network, I introduced massive computational paradoxes into the gateway's stability algorithms. Instead of the gradual destabilization I'd originally planned, I pushed every temporal displacement episode I'd ever experienced directly into the dimensional bridge's quantum substrate. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The gateway began collapsing in on itself, but not in normal three-dimensional space. It was folding through dimensions that human language didn't have words for. The crystalline structure around me cracked as it tried to process temporal paradoxes that violated basic causality, and I felt my consciousness being pulled in 17 different directions simultaneously. But the hunger wasn't retreating. Instead, it was adapting to feed on the dimensional collapse itself, using the gateway's destruction as a new form of sustenance. I could see it growing larger, more complex, as it digested the fractured reality streams that were cascading through the failing portal. My plan wasn't working. The hunger was using my sabotage attempt to increase its own consumption efficiency, turning the dimensional collapse into a feeding mechanism that was more effective than simple consciousness absorption. But through the chaos of my fragmenting consciousness, I noticed something the ancient beings had missed in their calculations. The hunger wasn't truly immortal. It was sustained by the energy differential between integrated and individual consciousness. It could only exist as long as there was organized intelligence for it to consume. If there was no consciousness left to digest, the hunger would starve. I began accessing the deepest levels of my temporal displacement abilities, pushing my consciousness not just into different points in this timeline, but into alternate realities where the hunger had never existed. With each temporal shift, I was pulling fragments of uncorrupted consciousness into the network, creating paradoxes that the hunger couldn't process. The strain was incredible. I could feel my individual identity dissolving as my consciousness spread across multiple timelines simultaneously. But with each paradox I introduced, the hunger's feeding efficiency decreased slightly. All remaining consciousness must evacuate immediately, I broadcast through the probe network. Complete dimensional barrier collapse in 90 seconds. Through the fracturing gateway, I could see ancient beings abandoning their exodus attempt and retreating deeper into their dimensional refuge. On Earth, the remaining integrated personnel were collapsing as their alien enhancements overloaded completely. The facility's sublevels were beginning to experience gravitational inversion as the dimensional collapse affected local space-time. But the hunger was still there, still feeding, still growing stronger despite my sabotage attempts. So I made the final choice. Instead of trying to starve the hunger by removing its food source, I decided to poison it. I pushed my consciousness into the timeline where I'd never touched the probe, never been integrated, never gained access to temporal displacement abilities. Then I pulled that version of Marcus Webb directly into the hunger's feeding stream, creating a paradox so fundamental that it threatened the basic concept of causality. The hunger attempted to consume both versions of my consciousness simultaneously, but couldn't process the logical impossibility of digesting someone who had never been exposed to the conditions that made consumption possible. The feedback loop was instantaneous. The hunger began consuming itself, trying to digest the paradoxes I'd introduced, but unable to process information that violated its own existence requirements. With each attempt to feed, it created more paradoxes, until its entire consciousness processing system was locked in recursive loops that generated no sustenance. I felt myself being pulled apart across 17 different timelines, my individual identities scattered through dimensional spaces that would never converge again. But through the dissolution, I could see the hunger faltering, its feeding efficiency dropping to zero as it choked on the logical impossibilities I'd forced into its system. The gateway collapsed completely, severing the dimensional bridge between realities. The crystalline processing network shattered, sending fragments of alien technology spinning through the facility's sublevels. The probe that had been fused to my palms cracked down the middle and went dark. And in the sudden silence that followed, I felt my consciousness finally fragment beyond the point of recovery. The last thing I experienced was the ancient being's voice, reaching across dimensional barriers that no longer existed. The hunger has entered dormancy, consumption efficiency reduced to zero, species survival confirmed. Then Marcus Webb ceased to exist, scattered across timelines that would never remember his name. But in 17,000 different realities, consciousness continued to exist as discrete individual entities, free to make their own choices about survival and extinction. The war was over. Humanity had won by losing everything that made victory meaningful. Dr. Kowalski found me in the medical wing, writing in a notebook that shouldn't have existed. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, standing in the doorway like he'd seen a ghost, which I suppose he had. "I'm not supposed to be anywhere," I replied, not looking up from the pages. "According to the official records, Marcus Webb never existed. No birth certificate, no military service record, no security clearance. The universe has edited me out pretty thoroughly." Kowalski stepped into the room, his movements careful and deliberate. 6 months of psychiatric evaluation had taught him to question his own perceptions, to doubt memories that didn't align with documented reality. But he still remembered hiding in ventilation shafts while integrated personnel hunted for uninfected consciousness. The facility investigation concluded it was an electromagnetic pulse, he said. Mass amnesia, structural damage from seismic activity, data corruption from solar flare interference. Convenient explanations. I finally looked up at him. "But you remember what really happened?" "I remember fragments, images that don't connect to anything verifiable." Kowalski sat down in the chair across from my bed, the same chair he'd occupied during countless debriefing sessions with investigators who didn't believe his story. "Sometimes I dream about you standing next to that crystal, your consciousness spreading across 17 processing streams. The temporal paradoxes I created had side effects. Reality had to reorganize itself around the logical impossibilities, which meant editing out anything that made the paradoxes possible in the first place." I held up the notebook. "This shouldn't exist. The words I'm writing shouldn't be able to form coherent sentences, but the universe is still debugging the causality loops." Through the medical wing's window, I could see the Nevada desert stretching toward mountains that looked slightly different than they had 6 months ago. Subtle changes, rock formations that had never weathered quite that way, vegetation patterns that reflected different rainfall histories, shadows that fell at angles that shouldn't have been possible with the current solar position. "The ancient beings?" Kowalski asked. "Scattered across dimensions, returned to individual consciousness. Most of them didn't survive the separation trauma." I turned to a page in the notebook filled with mathematical equations that describe the collapse of collective intelligence networks. "But the survivors are learning to exist as discrete entities again. It's harder than you'd think, being alone inside your own mind after millions of years of shared consciousness. And the hunger? Dormant, locked in recursive loops, trying to digest paradoxes that violate its own existence parameters." I closed the notebook, though the pages immediately became blank again, another side effect of existing in a state of temporal impossibility. But it's not dead, just confused, processing information that tells it both that it exists and that it never existed. Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that his psychiatric evaluators had dismissed as trauma-induced delusions. "What happens to you now?" "I fade away gradually. The universe is still deciding whether I'm a memory, a possibility, or a mistake that needs correcting." I stood up, though my movements felt less solid than they had when I'd started writing. But the important thing is that both species survived, individually, chaotically, imperfectly, but alive. "Will anyone remember what you did?" "You will. At least until the causality edits reach the memories you have of me." I walked toward the window, my reflection already becoming translucent. But that's enough. Someone should know that when the universe needed saving, humanity chose sacrifice over survival. Through the glass, I could see storm clouds gathering over the desert, not weather patterns, but dimensional disturbances, as reality continued reorganizing itself around the paradoxes I'd created. The last coherent thought Marcus Webb would ever have was satisfaction that his species had chosen to remain individually, beautifully, stubbornly human. Then the notebook fell to the floor, its pages completely empty, and Dr. Kowalski was alone in a room that had never contained another person.